Was Thomas Jefferson a hypocrite for owning slaves? It is one of those questions that seems deceptively simple, but the more you dig into it, the more complicated it becomes. On the surface, here is a man who wrote some of the most famous words in American history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Yet he lived his entire life surrounded by enslaved men, women, and children, and he personally owned hundreds of them. That contradiction has fascinated and disturbed people for centuries. But before we rush to an easy answer, it's worth stepping back and asking, who was Thomas Jefferson really? What did slavery mean in his time? And how do we judge someone who lived more than 200 years ago by today's standards? This is the story of Jefferson's ideals, his contradictions, and the world he lived in. Thomas Jefferson was born in 1743 in Virginia, a colony already deeply rooted in the system of slavery. His father was a wealthy landowner, and the Jefferson family owned enslaved laborers. From his earliest years, Jefferson's life was shaped by a system that was considered normal, necessary, and even unquestionable by most of the white elite. Yet Jefferson grew up to become a man of extraordinary intellect, a lawyer, a philosopher, and eventually the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. In that document, Jefferson crafted words that have inspired revolutions across the world. He spoke of liberty, natural rights, and the equality of all men before their Creator. And so, the paradox begins. How could the man who wrote those words at the age of 33 continue to profit from a system that denied liberty and equality to so many? The numbers tell a stark story. Over the course of his lifetime, Jefferson owned more than 600 enslaved people. At Monticello, his estate in Virginia, dozens lived and worked, cultivating the land, cooking his meals, caring for his children, and maintaining his household. And yet, Jefferson never freed the majority of them. At his death in 1826, he still held people in bondage, and only a handful were freed through his will. This reality has led many critics to say, without hesitation, that Jefferson was indeed a hypocrite, a man who failed to live up to the very ideals he helped enshrine into America's founding documents. But others caution that the story is not so straightforward. Jefferson did not invent slavery, nor was he unique in owning enslaved laborers. He was born into it. By the mid-18th century, Virginia's economy and society were built upon slavery. Landowners relied on enslaved labor to maintain their plantations, and wealth and power were tied to it. For a man of Jefferson's class, rejecting slavery entirely would have meant not just economic ruin, but also social isolation. This doesn't excuse it, but it complicates our picture. Was Jefferson trapped by his times, or did he willingly perpetuate an injustice he knew was wrong? To answer that, we need to look at what Jefferson himself said about slavery. In his writings, Jefferson repeatedly condemned the institution as morally corrupting and harmful to both enslaved people and their masters. In his Notes on the State of Virginia, published in 1785, he described slavery as a moral and political evil, one that threatened the survival of the American Republic. He even admitted that he trembled for his country when he reflected that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. Strong words indeed, and they show that Jefferson was not blind to the contradiction. Yet, even as he acknowledged slavery's evil, Jefferson claimed he could not find a practical solution to it. He worried that emancipation would lead to violent conflict between white and black populations, believing that centuries of oppression had created too deep a divide. Instead of promoting integration, Jefferson argued that if slavery were ever abolished, freed people should be sent to Africa or elsewhere outside the United States, a vision of colonization rather than coexistence. In this way, Jefferson's imagination of freedom remained limited. He could envision liberty for white Americans, but he struggled to extend it fully to those who were enslaved. And this is where the charge of hypocrisy grows sharper. Jefferson was not just a passive figure living in a slave-holding society. He was a leader, a man who shaped ideas and laws. He had opportunities at various moments in his career to push harder against slavery. As president, he signed a law banning the international slave trade in 1808, but he took no major steps to challenge slavery within the United States. In Virginia, he drafted proposals for gradual emancipation early in his career, but he never fought vigorously to see them adopted. And at Monticello, despite his wealth and influence, he did little to improve the lives of those he enslaved. Some historians argue that Jefferson's debts, mismanagement, and reliance on his plantation's output kept him bound to slavery. Others argue that he simply lacked the courage to confront the system that benefited him. But before we rush to judge, let's consider the larger context. Jefferson lived in a world where slavery was not just accepted, but considered essential by many of his peers. Even figures like George Washington, who eventually freed his slaves in his will, struggled with the same contradictions. Many of the founding fathers spoke of liberty while owning enslaved people. The difference with Jefferson is that he gave the contradiction its most eloquent expression. The man who declared all men equal was also the man who held others in bondage. That made his hypocrisy more glaring, more unforgettable. At Monticello, the lives of enslaved people reveal another side of Jefferson's story. Families like the Hemmingses lived and worked on the plantation, some of them serving directly in Jefferson's household. Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who was also the half-sister of Jefferson's late wife, bore several of Jefferson's children. Their relationship, unequal by its very nature, has become a central point in debates about Jefferson's legacy. Did Jefferson see his own children with Hemings as equal? He did not free all of them, though several were eventually allowed to leave Monticello and live as free people. The personal and the political intersect here in ways that show just how deep Jefferson's contradictions ran. And this raises another question. When we call someone a hypocrite, what do we mean? A hypocrite is someone who says one thing but does another. In Jefferson's case, he said that all men are created equal, yet he owns slaves. That seems like an open and shut case. But some argue that hypocrisy also requires a degree of conscious dishonesty, of knowingly betraying one's principles. Did Jefferson see himself as a betrayer of his own ideals, or did he genuinely believe that his actions could be reconciled with his words? The answer is not so clear. Jefferson seemed tormented by the issue of slavery, but he always found reasons, economic, social, political, not to take the bold step of ending it in his own life. Historians remain divided. Some emphasize Jefferson's words against slavery as evidence that he was ahead of his time, even if he failed to act fully on them. Others argue that words without action are empty, and that Jefferson's failure to free his slaves, even when he had the chance, reveals his true priorities. Still others take a middle ground, seeing Jefferson as both a visionary and a deeply flawed man, someone whose ideas about liberty helped transform the world, but whose personal life showed the limits of those ideas. In the end, the question of whether Jefferson was a hypocrite tells us as much about ourselves as it does about him. When we look back at historical figures, we often want them to be either heroes or villains. We want clarity, but human beings are rarely so simple. Jefferson embodied both the highest ideals of the Enlightenment and the darkest realities of American slavery. He was a man of his time, but also a man who helped shape the future. His contradictions remind us that history is complicated, that progress is uneven, and that the legacies of the past are never entirely comfortable. So, was Thomas Jefferson a hypocrite? Perhaps the more useful question is, what does his contradiction teach us? It teaches us that the words we cherish about liberty, equality, and rights were written in a world where those words were not applied to everyone. It teaches us that ideals can inspire revolutions even when their authors fail to live by them. And it teaches us that the struggle to live up to our highest principles is ongoing, unfinished, and deeply human. As we reflect on Jefferson, we also reflect on ourselves. How do we reconcile our ideals with our actions? How do we judge the past without excusing it? And how do we learn from it without oversimplifying it? These are questions that extend far beyond one man and his legacy. And maybe that is why Jefferson's story continues to matter. It is not just the story of one founding father, it is the story of America itself, with all its brilliance and all its contradictions. If you found this exploration thought-provoking, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Jefferson was a hypocrite, or was he simply a product of his time? Your perspective adds to the conversation, and history, after all, is not just about the past. It's about how we understand it today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.